Tatiana Schlossberg, JFK's 35-year-old granddaughter and daughter of Caroline Kennedy, has died.
There is a kind of grief that most of us will never have to learn how to carry. And there is a woman who has been forced to learn it again and again since she was 5 years old. Her name is Caroline Kennedy. She has buried a father, an uncle, a mother, a brother, and now, at 68 years old, her own daughter. This is not a story built for tabloids or trending headlines. It is the story of what it actually looks like to survive loss after loss after loss, and to keep standing anyway. Caroline Bouvier Kennedy was born on November 27, 1957, the first child of a young senator named John F. Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline. From the moment she arrived, she belonged to a family that the country was already watching closely, and within a few short years, that attention would grow into something far larger than any child could reasonably be prepared for. When her father won the presidency in 1960, Caroline was only 3 years old. She spent her earliest memories inside the White House, a place most people only ever see in photographs, walking hallways that were, to her, simply home. There was a swing set on the lawn, a nursery school set up for her and a handful of other children, and a father who by every account doted on her whenever the demands of the presidency allowed it. Images of Caroline playing beneath the resolute desk while her father worked became some of the most beloved photographs of the era, not because they were staged for the press, but because they captured something real, a busy, powerful man who still made room to be a parent. That ordinary childhood ended on November 22, 1963. Caroline was 5 years old, just days from her 6th birthday, when her father was assassinated in Dallas. The trauma of that day did not stay contained to her family. It became a shared national wound, replayed constantly in photographs, newsreels, and later in documentaries and textbooks. The picture of young Caroline standing beside her mother at the funeral, solemn in a way no child should have to be, is burned into the memory of an entire country. For Caroline, though, it wasn't a historical image. It was the day her father disappeared. And unlike most children who lose a parent, she would never be allowed to grieve privately. Her loss became public property, revisited every anniversary, every election cycle, every retrospective about the Kennedy era, for the rest of her life. The next devastating blow came less than 5 years later. In 1968, when Caroline was 10, her uncle Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles on the night he won the California presidential primary. Bobby had, in many ways, stepped into the space her father left behind, and his death meant Caroline lost that steadying presence all over again. She was old enough this time to understand exactly what had happened, and to understand that the world she lived in was one where the men she loved most kept being taken from her in acts of sudden violence. Her mother, Jacqueline Kennedy, spent the years after 1963 trying to shield her children from a public that would not leave them alone. That effort partly explains her controversial 1968 marriage to Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis, a decision that shocked much of the country, but that gave Jackie a measure of privacy, security, and distance from Washington that she believed her children badly needed. For Caroline, adolescence unfolded under a somewhat quieter version of the spotlight, though never a fully private one. In the 1970s, Caroline did something that, given her circumstances, was genuinely remarkable. She built an ordinary life. She studied at Radcliffe College and later earned a law degree from Columbia University. In 1986, she married Edwin Schlossberg, a designer and museum exhibit creator who had little interest in political life and a great deal of interest in a stable, private partnership. Together, they raised 3 children, Rose, Tatiana, and Jack. For nearly a decade, it looked as though Caroline had found something like solid ground. Then, in 1994, her mother was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died that May at the age of 64. Caroline, now in her mid-30s, had lost both of her parents to 2 of the most brutal forces a life can deliver: political violence and disease. 5 years later, tragedy struck again, and this time it took the one person who had walked through every previous loss beside her. On July 16, 1999, her younger brother, John F. Kennedy Jr., was piloting a small plane to Martha's Vineyard along with his wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister, Lauren Bessette. The plane went down over the Atlantic, and all three were killed. John was 38. For Caroline, this loss carried a particular kind of devastation, because John wasn't simply her brother. He was the only other human being alive who had lived through every one of those earlier losses alongside her, who understood without explanation what it meant to grow up as a Kennedy, defined by grief. At 41, Caroline became the last surviving member of her immediate family. What followed in the decades after 1999 is, in many ways, the part of Caroline Kennedy's story that gets the least attention, even though it may be the most instructive. She did not withdraw from public life. She built one deliberately and on her own terms. She co-authored several books on constitutional rights and American history. She helped guide the profile in Courage Award, an honor established in her father's name to recognize public officials who choose principle over political convenience. In 2008, she gave a rare and closely watched endorsement of Barack Obama's presidential campaign, comparing the sense of possibility he inspired to what she remembered of her father. In 2013, President Obama appointed her as United States Ambassador to Japan, making her the first woman to hold that post. And she served with a reputation for careful, substantive diplomacy rather than ceremonial appearances. In 2022, President Biden named her ambassador to Australia, where she worked on climate policy and regional security until late 2024. Across 6 decades of public attention, she built something that belonged to her rather than something she simply inherited. Then came the loss that, even set against everything before it, stands apart. In May 2024, Caroline's daughter Tatiana Schlossberg, then 34 years old, gave birth to her second child. During that same hospital stay, doctors noticed an alarmingly high white blood cell count and ran further tests. The diagnosis that followed was acute myeloid leukemia, and not an ordinary case of it. Tatiana carried a rare genetic mutation known as inversion 3, one of the most difficult forms of the disease to treat successfully. She spent weeks in the hospital before beginning treatment, later underwent a bone marrow transplant using cells donated by her sister Rose, and for a time went into remission. But the leukemia returned. She then entered a clinical trial for CAR T-cell therapy, a last resort treatment for patients who have exhausted more conventional options. Tatiana Schlossberg was not simply Caroline Kennedy's daughter. She had built her own respected career as a journalist. A graduate of Yale University with a graduate degree in American history from Oxford, she had worked as a science and environmental reporter for the New York Times and had written a well-regarded book on the hidden environmental costs of everyday consumption. She was known among colleagues as sharp, funny, and deeply serious about the work she chose to do. In November 2025, with her illness now understood to be terminal, Tatiana wrote an essay for The New Yorker describing what it was like to receive a fatal diagnosis in the same hours she became a mother for the second time. She wrote candidly about her fear that her 2 young children would not remember her, and about the strange experience of watching her own life unfold as both a mother raising small children and a patient facing the end of hers. She also used the essay to speak publicly about her concerns regarding her cousin, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and his approach to federal health and vaccine policy while serving in the Trump administration, writing that she watched his confirmation from a hospital bed as she underwent treatment for the very disease his policy decisions touched. The essay was widely read, not as political commentary, but as an unusually honest account of what it feels like to be told, in your mid-30s, that your time is now measured in months. On December 30th, 2025, Tatiana Schlossberg died. She was 35 years old. Her family announced her death through a statement posted to the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation's social media account, signed by her husband, her parents, and her siblings. She left behind her husband, physician George Moran, and their 2 young children, a son and a daughter. For Caroline Kennedy, this was not simply another entry in a long list of losses. Clinicians who study grief consistently describe the death of a child as among the most severe forms of bereavement a parent can experience, in part because it inverts the order that families are built to expect. Parents are supposed to precede their children. When that expectation breaks, it breaks something in the structure of a person's understanding of the world along with it. Caroline had now outlived her father, her uncle, her mother, her brother, and her own daughter. True to the pattern that has defined her entire public life, Caroline did not turn her grief into a public spectacle. Tatiana's funeral was held on January 5, 2026, at the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola on Manhattan's Upper East Side, the same church where Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis's funeral had taken place more than 3 decades earlier. It was described by those who attended, including former President Joe Biden and former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, as an intensely private ceremony despite the presence of prominent guests. Caroline said nothing publicly in the weeks that followed. She simply disappeared into the work of grieving and of helping raise her grandchildren alongside her husband and her surviving children, Rose and Jack. It was not until 5 months later, on May 31, 2026, that Caroline spoke about her daughter's death in public for the first time. The occasion was the annual Profile in Courage Award ceremony at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, an event Caroline herself had helped shape for decades. Standing at the same podium where she had presided over the award through so many difficult chapters of her life, she paused to remember Tatiana, describing her as someone who had served on the library's board and who had represented, in Caroline's words, everything her parents had stood for across a beautiful, remarkable, and far too short life. The audience responded with a sustained ovation that reportedly lasted nearly 20 seconds, the kind of response that comes less from ceremony and more from people who are genuinely moved and unsure of what else to do with the feeling. Caroline then thanked them, composed herself, and continued with the evening's program, presenting that year's award to Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell and to the people of Minnesota's Twin Cities. That single detail says as much about Caroline Kennedy as any of the tragedies themselves. She stood at a podium months after burying her youngest daughter, allowed herself a brief, unguarded moment of visible grief in front of an audience, and then went on with the work in front of her. It is a pattern she has repeated her entire life. She does not perform sorrow, and she does not hide from it either. She simply continues. What makes Caroline Kennedy's story worth telling isn't the sheer volume of tragedy attached to her name, though that volume is almost impossible to comprehend. It is the fact that none of those losses became the entire story. She earned a serious legal education. She built a nearly 40-year marriage in a family where lasting partnerships were not always the norm. She raised 3 children largely outside the glare that consumed so much of her own childhood, and by every public account, she succeeded, at least in part, since Tatiana grew into a woman with genuine convictions and a career built on more than her last name. Caroline represented her country abroad with a reputation for substance rather than spectacle. And when her daughter was dying, she did not give interviews or issue statements. She went to the hospital. She helped care for 2 small grandchildren while their mother fought for her life. She did the unglamorous, exhausting work of simply being present, the same work her own mother had once done for her. There is no tidy lesson at the end of this. Caroline Kennedy's life does not resolve into something that makes the losses feel worthwhile or explainable. Her father was murdered. Her uncle was murdered. Her mother died of cancer. Her brother died in a plane crash. Her daughter, only 35 years old and the mother of 2 small children, died of an aggressive blood cancer that gave her barely more than a year from diagnosis to death. Those facts do not add up to anything redemptive. They are simply what happened, one after another, across 6 decades. What can be said is this. At every one of those moments, Caroline Kennedy kept going. Not by pretending the losses didn't hurt, and not by disappearing into them either, but by refusing to let any single loss become the whole of who she was. Today, at 68, she is raising 2 grandchildren who are growing up without their mother, doing for them what her own mother once did for her, keeping the person they lost present through stories, photographs, and the steady, patient love that only someone who has survived exactly this kind of grief can offer. It is, in its own way, one of the most demanding forms of courage there is, because holding a grieving child together requires staying present inside your own grief rather than running from it. Caroline Kennedy did not choose the life she was given. Nobody would choose it. But at every turn where it might have been reasonable to fold, she has instead chosen, quietly and without any need for applause, to keep standing. That, more than the tragedy itself, is the story worth remembering?